Welcome to the Transfer Flow and the first of our Transfer Grades podcast for summer 2024. We start with Arsenal, who made some solid signings this window, but failed to improve their attacking depth. And Ravi and I disagree a bit on the quality of the incoming transfers. We also have grades for the next 4 Premier League teams in alphabetical order, namely Aston Villa's PSR-driven offseason and some good business by them in offloading Douglas Luiz and Moussa Diaby. But did the incoming substantially improve the Champions League team? Next, Bournemouth's big sale, Dominic Solanke, where they might replace his production with some incomings, but, it's tough to tell. There's some risk involved in those. Finally, we finished explaining why we rated Brentford's window a mild success and discuss how Brighton's aggressive approach might pay off for them in propelling them into those regular Champions League spots. Is it good enough? Are they taking big risks? Could it come crashing down around their ears? Enjoy. Greetings and welcome to the Transfer Flow podcast version. We are also a newsletter. You can find us on thetransferflow.com/subscribe to sign up to our daily newsletter. You will receive transfer analysis, game analysis, and some gambling stuff 5 days a week. Gambling stuff is scheduled to be launched in the back half of September. It's late because someone, namely me, took a month-long holiday after selling his business called StatsBomb, and that is put us a little bit behind. We are joined today by Ravi Ramaneni, a longtime analytics professional, formerly the director of analytics, VP of analytics at Seattle Sounders, among other things. We all have titles and stuff. At one point at Smart Odds, which is Matthew Benham's betting syndicate, he let people create their own titles, and one person was named King of Scotland. So there you go. Sometimes it's good to be flexible. Speaking of flexibility, though, we are going to talk about the transfer grades for the first 5 alphabetical teams in the Premier League today. And the reason why we're doing it this way is so that we can show that we hate every team equally. So that if you're in the YouTube comments, you know that we hate your team 1/20th of the total amount of hate that we have in the world.
Yeah, and happy to have you back, Ted. It's been a while. We spoke on a podcast together.
It was much needed. It was also really weird to start doing podcasts by myself. So I did 2 introduction gambling podcasts that are out there, and I was just talking to myself. And in the future, we'll do things like we'll have more slides and stuff like that. You can also expect us to see graphics sort of put into this one, but you got to start somewhere. And sometimes somewhere is completely by yourself in a hotel room halfway around the world. Anyway, you want to start with a team that I know you have been close to, maybe via marriage, at times throughout the last decade plus. Why don't we start with Arsenal?
Yeah, let's start with them. Top of the alphabetical order.
For those who don't know, Ravi's wife is Sarah Rudd. She's an OG in the football analytics space, brilliant woman. And at one point, she was employed by StatDNA, which were the data company that Arsenal bought. Just for full transparency here, that doesn't mean that Ravi's going to pull any punches with regard to his analysis. It just means that maybe he knows a lot of people who have worked there or do work there or whatever. And so, insight's a useful thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's left a few years ago, and, I think this analysis has nothing to, I try to stay away from any of that.
Oh, you're being so nice. Come on, I set you up to be like, yes, I'm a huge transfer guru. And there's just this modesty, this exceptional modesty. It's ridiculous. Get out of here with that. Come on, step forward to the plate. Let's go. he's a Villarreal fan. Let's be honest. He's a Villarreal fan.
Yeah. So I think that, as we gave the grades yesterday, I thought all of us were kind of in agreement. Like they kind of graded around A-, B+, A, around there. I think
for the incomings.
For the incomings, yeah.
Right.
I think for me, they've done really well. First of all, I think a team that is so settled, they knew what they sort of needed, their needs were, and addressed them pretty early. That's usually a sign of organization that has everything lined up in order and go after it and just get the player they want. So I thought that was one thing that they've done well. And what that also allowed them is towards the end, when the Sterling situation slowly started developing and, there were no takers for that salary, and Chelsea ended up having to pay a lot of the salary. And they had the opportunity to just add a piece that's that's a really good piece to the rotation, a starter level player to a group of a good attacking side, but maybe little thin on the depth because the squad is very compact, I would say. So I thought that was a really good. And usually you won't be able to do these things unless you get your work done early. And I think this is something that's forgotten, is that it's all great getting a deal done like the 3 or 4 deals done in the last couple of days, but that usually means you're throwing a bunch of stuff is slipping through the cracks and you just have to clean up later. I think that was really good that they were kind of like, okay, we're going to wait to see what develops and what falls in our lap type of situation.
So I think Kim and I were a little bit tougher on the incomings on this one. I had a B- and Kim had a B-. And I want to explain that because I think that like I'm a little less rosy in the preparation and how things played out here. Calafiori, I think, is interesting, and I like him as a player. Apparently, Arsenal, he got through the medical, so they judged his past medical history as acceptable in terms of risk. 50 million is pretty much full freight for what they would pay for him. It was kind of a position that doesn't fully fill in need, in that it feels like they're trying to take a guy who is a center back, maybe a little bit DM, but a left-footed one, has decent pace, and convert him into what Ben White does on the right side.
Yes.
So like, you've got a fullback center back effectively is what White does. And he's pretty unique. And that role is actually quite unique in football. It allows them to be better at set pieces and have another weapon or two there. White's been very, very good since they brought him in. Calafiori, I have a little more uncertainty, but like I want to take down some of the credit you're talking about for getting deals done early. Like Merino came in late and then unfortunately has a fractured shoulder from a training session in the first bit. That was a need that they had all summer. Their defensive midfielder need has actually been sort of rampant since the sort of cliff that Thomas Partey's physical output has fallen off over the last couple of years. So that's pretty late. I do appreciate the Sterling move. Like that was a very rapidly developing situation. I like that type of thing. And in fact, Arsenal have history for this because one of the things that Wenger used to do is he used to like to sit on a pile of cash. And one of the problems is that, like, they brought in players too late in the window sometimes to actually use them for the first 4 games. But he'd like to sit on a pile of cash because it allowed him to bring in players like a Santi Cazorla or
Mesut Ozil.
Ozil was a late one. Monreal was another late one. And because they had that cash and because they'd done all the work, they were able to act quickly. Sterling effectively is a like for like replacement for Reece Nelson being able to go out on loan. He's definitely an improvement on Nelson, but that was going into, if they hadn't gotten a bit lucky, which is what happened, that was going into the season looking like, wow, we have no depth in attack. And we also may struggle if we have injuries in midfield as well. It's a well-constructed first 11, but I don't feel comfortable saying that it's a great squad at this point because they shifted and changed a lot of the outgoings, which were good, but it does mean that they needed some replacements that I think maybe it was a hangover from last summer's big spending that needed to be a little more cautious and prudent this summer. That's totally fine, but we do have to judge kind of on the outputs of this year.
Yeah, and I think the one area where I think I thought they needed some depth, as you said, is also the number 9 position. I think with Nketiah leaving, he's played about 14 90s in the last couple of seasons, 14 each. Mm-hmm. And that's not, you can see that's not a whole lot, but now I think you just have Havertz and Jesus probably the ones that would have to. But maybe this is something that they will address in the winter transfer window. But it was one of those where I think to get a starter level player for Arsenal at that position would cost a lot of money.
Osimhen was allegedly offered to them early in the window, but Napoli, who had an insanely bad transfer window, possibly one of the worst ones in the world this year, allegedly were trying to ask for 120 million euros for Osimhen for most of the summertime, which was also like not in the ballpark of acceptability. So you can always say that they're shopping for values. And if you do your work ahead of time, you kind of know where players might slot in. But also, they're going into the season having to compete, for the league, for the Champions League, basically riding off the cups potentially if those things are in play, because they just don't have the depth to be able to run players out there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
All right, moving along, we've got Aston Villa, who are weird. And this is one that I think has divided most people who've looked at them, because it's a little bit difficult with the PSR moves alongside of their normal moves to to sort of parse fully exactly what happened. But the context is they unexpectedly made the Champions League last year. And so they needed a bit of firepower to be able to push on, but they also needed some sales to be able to make sure they stayed out of trouble in the PSR space.
Yeah, I think Aston Villa had a very hectic window. Bought a lot of players, a lot of them young players. It's like I looked at the 7 of the 8 players that they paid transfer fee that was accounted for this season were under 23, and 6 of them were under 22. So a lot of young talent. So I don't know what that would mean for in terms of how many of these can be out and out starters, start contributing right away. So there may be a little bit of growing pains there. In terms of outgoings, I thought they did really well. Moussa, Diaby, and Douglas Luiz, they got good value for them. And again, I think selling them earlier in the window helped them to get the money and then use that to buy all these players.
Well, the timing was dictated by the PSR window, right? So like that kind of forced their hand. Look, we have to be prudent and move early because we have this June deadline and not an August 31st deadline.
Yeah, no, I think that's my biggest take there is that how they will integrate some of these younger players and how they can extract maximum out of them in a Champions League season, which has 8 matches now in group stage. That would be interesting thing to see.
I think my favorite signing of theirs is Ian Maatson, who was a left back at Borussia Dortmund last year. Dortmund made the Champions League final. Didn't have the best German season or Bundesliga season, but anytime that you make the Champions League final, it feels like it's probably okay. I don't know. I like that as a left back. He was very capable. He's got an inflated PSR price. It feels like it's difficult to tell exactly what price anybody paid here. Amadou Onana, very large, impressive specimen in midfield. I really liked him coming out of Lille a few years ago, and then he went to Everton, and you're like, he's playing the Sean Dyche style. Like, how good is he really? Sometimes it's difficult to see the full spectrum of what a player could do in a system that kind of constrains them to have a very disciplined role. They paid full price for him, but they definitely needed the player too. So like they had roles they needed to fill. Cameron Archer had a ridiculous sort of in-out thing. I think he was a Villa Academy product. They might have had a buyback or a loan back from Sheffield United, and he just sort of waved as everybody going through the building as he then went down to the South Coast, down at Southampton. Jaden Philogene is a wild card coming out of Hull. Yeah. He had the funniest, weirdest agent story of the summertime. His agent was alleged to have just showed up at Barcelona trying to flog him. Then the day later, it was reported he did actually have a meeting. But nobody still understands how Jayden Philogene would be potentially good enough for Barcelona. And the question is whether he might be good enough as a backup for Villa. Maybe he gets strong cup minutes and maybe he's, again, a bit of a backup. And they have just like all of this PSR chaff of guys that came through as part of the Douglas Luiz deal that are never going to see minutes there. They just had to be make weights to make the accounting stuff make sense, which is a very weird thing when you think of the player impact of this stuff. But apparently the players were okay enough and financially compensated enough that they are willing to take that transfer risk.
Yeah, one last bit about Onana. I think playing at Everton, one of the hardest things to measure in analytics is how to value, how to rate a good player in a bad team, and so is his numbers down because the team is down, the team is not a very good team, or something else. So there's multiple effects mixed here, so it's hard to know. So I think that's where I think that putting him around better players empirically feels like at Villa feels like he will look better, but we'll wait and see.
I definitely feel like he's better than Douglas Luiz. But I feel like any above average player is going to be better than Douglas Luiz, and especially for the price paid, he should be better than Douglas Luiz. The outgoings are good. Moussa Diaby, I feel like they recovered and actually made a small profit on an overpay for an attacker from the Bundesliga last year. Whatever price they really got for Douglas Luiz is good enough. Kellyman is a make weight. Cameron Archer had that funny one. They sold one of their kids to Everton, who's immediately slotted in the midfield. But that's more of a comment on how weak the Everton squad is, which we'll talk about in the bottom half. So yeah, I like this. I like their outgoings a lot. They had to do sales. It was necessary, but also I think they did a good job there. I think our overall grade was an A- on that one. Arsenal's overall grade was kind of a B+. Ravi disagrees with Kim and I a little bit on the incomings there. Down to the South Coast, Bournemouth. Do you know the size of the Bournemouth Stadium?
Like 15,000?
It's less, and it has one of the worst camera angles in the world. And I think they might have fixed it this past season, but I think they were down at about 11,000 total capacity for a while. So anytime you see the Bournemouth Stadium, like one of the big teams play down there, you're like, this camera angle sucks. Like, why does it look like this? It's because there's no height in the stadium to be able to look at stuff. This also causes problems when you're trying to create tracking data, like both of us have worked with, because you can't get the right homography, especially across the other side of the pitch. Weird, funny note. But so Bournemouth had a funky offseason. They changed kind of how their football team is run at the top end. Someone that you know, and Tim, can you pronounce that last name for me?
Bazbachenko.
Bazbachenko. That's an excellent name. Excellent. So he came from America to sort of oversee the football side of stuff. And then Tiago Pinto, who was at Roma, has come in as, I think, now their full-on sporting director. We have an interesting arrangement of people. Anyway, so that's the context for what this window looks like. Now, what did you think of their incomings and outgoings?
I thought they did very well both ways, both incoming and outgoing. My take was that they've done well. Let's start with outgoings. Dominic Solanke, big sale. I think they got full value for him. I think it's always good to get that full value, and he's in his prime, like 26, probably middle of his prime. So I think that kind of set them up for a very good window, so to say. Well, it did happen towards the later part, but still, I think that sale probably the discussions were on for a long time, so they knew that was going to happen, and that meant that they needed to replace him. That's a big ask. I think they went ahead and got Evanilson from Porto, who I think if you look at his numbers in Portugal, he's pretty good. I think I think always the question mark whenever you're looking at strikers moving from Portugal to the Premier League is how well do these numbers translate? And Porto is a giant in one of the three big clubs in Portugal, so a lot of his goals probably were against much weaker teams. So I think that having that aside, I thought that for me, like, that was a really, really good window for them. They've also they've also made permanent the loan of Enes Unal, who I think a long time ago was a City Football Group product, if I'm not wrong. And then he was at Villarreal for a bit.
He's quite as traded in Spain for a long time now. Right?
Yeah,
you and I have been around long enough. We remember scouting him basically as a teenager. And you're like, this kid seems pretty interesting. And then he goes to Spain and he has like a couple good seasons. And then he just kind of like disappears and has a really weird role. In the same way that Joshua Zirkzee has a really weird role, but different. Like Enes Unal is almost a footballer that doesn't exist in a lot of top tier systems these days. He's a big man that wins a lot of stuff in the air, like sort of the Andy Carroll style footballer, I guess. And he's very elite at what he does. The question is, who needs what he does?
Yeah, and I think he did well. I think he resurrected his career to a degree at Getafe, and then he came on loan to Bournemouth, where he did well enough that they made the move permanent. So I think that they, will between Evanilson and Enes Unal, will they replace the production of Dominic Solanke? We'll wait and see. But I think they've done enough to replace him, at least on paper. So we'll see how that goes. But I thought in general their window. The other one I think this signing is Luis Sinisterra. I liked him. I like him a lot, that player.
I feel like they signed average or above average players almost across the board. And for someone like Bournemouth to be able to bring in players of that quality, like that's a good window. It's
Yeah.
not, I mean, in fact, for them, it's probably a great window. Like you've
Yeah.
got players that have some risk involved, but anytime you're getting a starting center forward and, from outside, maybe a big club, it's a surprise that he's at Bournemouth in the first place. Maybe you're going to have to take some risk on, but they didn't overpay for him. Sinisterra is clearly good enough to be in the league and be a quality player. Unal's a nice change of pace. Araujo is capable. Like, I don't know if he's going to be elite, but he's certainly capable. And the one that I particularly like is, especially given how crazy the young center back market was this summer, like Dean, and I wish that Patrick was here because he pronounced this right, but Dean Huijsen, they paid basically a total of 15 million pounds. This is a kid, he's a Danish kid, but he was in Juve's youth teams, and he was commanding. He was imperious in those teams. Like he looked like nothing could possibly bother him. He's probably too young to evaluate as a center back, especially from a purely data perspective. But when you scout him, you're like, man, I get it. And he's immediately slotted in. Like that shouldn't be a thing, and yet it is. So if that's the case and he's not a train wreck, this is a great window from them, at least from an inbound side. And we both agree on the outbounds. Anytime you get full freight for a player that's 26 years old and you want to sell him, and you're looking at 60 million pounds or so, like that's a good deal. I really like it. I think they did an excellent job this summer.
Yeah, so Bournemouth, I have A's across the board, inbound, outbound, overall. I thought they had a great window. I think to your point, just to stress on the point about like teams like Bournemouth getting above average talent is actually a great window, because sometimes it's not that, well, they can spend $30 million, but the $30 million that Arsenal can spend is probably will attract a different type of player than a $30 million spent by Bournemouth. And that's the reality.
And part of that is because there's not wage implications inside of these transfer deal numbers. Like many times a Bournemouth player is coming on 40% of the wages that an Arsenal player would be, even for a similar sort of fee that's attached to that. The trick for the big clubs is not to overpay for the same sort of player, right? Like, hey, don't make that player be 50 million when he's actually a 30 million pound player. So it's an interesting set of constraints that you have to deal with from place to place, and most people don't quite understand how that works inside the clubs. Moving on to West London, I'm gonna wrap this on the back end because I am a former Brentford employee and usually have followed them fairly closely. So I'll let you tee this one off and tell me who you want to talk about.
I want to talk about. I think they've done well. The Toney sale, I thought they've done well in the end. I think it just dragged on for a bit. And, obviously with Saudi involved and their window deadline being different, I think that's something that clubs have to reckon with. It's like a asymmetric thing to deal with. The other thing is they signed a couple of players from Liverpool. I quite like Fabio Carvalho. I watched him in the preseason games in the US. I thought he was pretty good. But I didn't think that he would challenge the guys that are there at Liverpool on the wings or
I think that's a comment on how good Liverpool's attacking players are, and less a comment on the quality of Carvalho.
Sure.
Let's just be honest. Liverpool knocked it out of the park for about 5 or 6 years there with their attacking guys. They would buy younger guys as sort of early backup or depth play, knowing that they would just mature into starters, and that's what they've done.
Yeah. And I think the one that they signed to replace Toney, Igor Thiago, that's probably one I want to talk about. Like he seemed injury prone coming in, and then he got injured in the preseason. So I think from what I read on Transfermarkt, he's out till December. So that's a big loss.
So Igor Thiago comes from Club Bruges. Bruges, I think, won their title in the Belgian league last year. He comes in as a player that is not an elite goal scorer, but we talked to somebody who's quite familiar with the league that we're friends with, and they were basically like, he does everything else pretty well or very well. It is a fairly decent sized fee. But decent sized fee being like 27 million pounds allegedly. that's kind of the going rate for what you're trying to pick up as a starting center forward if you're a Premier League team. If you're a big team, then it's like 70, 80 million pounds, it seems like is sort of the average range. And then, the peaks are going to be up around 110, 120, which are unusual because not many teams can afford that outright. And the wage package on that is outrageous. Thiago has that injury risk, which is something that, well, let's come back around to Brentford. Brentford, for quite a long time, were able to find undervalued talent and just print money because they were able to scout them early. They would bring them into England, and then other teams would feel comfortable that they understood these players were good enough to play in England or in the Premier League. Then they would sell them on for anywhere between 2 times and sort of 12 times the value of what they bought them for. I was there for a couple of years early on in this model. They had a slightly different style of play when they were in the Championship than when they've been in the Premier League. And then the last couple of years, the inbounds and the outbounds have suffered a little bit. They mostly were trying to stabilize being in the Premier League, which they succeeded on. And the reality is the money in the Premier League versus the money in the Championship means that you would much rather stay in the Premier League than to sell another player for 20 or 30 million pounds. If selling that player gave you significant risk in dropping 100 million in revenue every single year. This year, it seems like they're comfortable that they have been in the Premier League. They're fairly unlikely to get relegated. They underperformed their metrics a bit last year. They seem like they were basically a mid-table team. And so they're willing to spend and basically reload the cabinet in potential talent. So Thiago, I think we're both a little bit on the fence about. I think he's fine, but not necessarily good. I like the Carvalho signing. I like Liverpool got a coup when they signed Carvalho out of the Fulham academy. And as we said, the sale here is less about Carvalho's talent than more about how good Liverpool's attacking squad is right now. So they were able to let him go. I think they trebled whatever the alleged fee is. So that's pretty good as well. They might have a sell-on clause there too. Vandenberg's the one that I'm sort of least confident about. Like, how do we feel about a center back that, has been on a few loans and a bit of a journeyman? He's still young though. And sometimes you got to take a bit of a risk. So I don't hate that. The Toney fee is good. Toney fee is genuinely, I think they had hoped that he would go to a place like Tottenham, but they backdoored into a Saudi deal because Osimhen's crew decided that nothing was going to happen there. Then there's 2 more, which is basically Gustavo Nunez. I don't have any opinion, like 18-year-old winger from Brazil. I know that group has been scouting South America a lot more in the last 5 years. It's something that we pushed very early on in like 14, 15, saying, hey, there's a lot of value down here in the second tier or in the depth of Brazil to be able to find talent as long as we invest both the time and energy and the data money. But when you import them, you also need to make sure they're comfortable. And in Denmark, you're like, does anybody around here even speak Spanish? And the answer was no. So it took a little while to potentially build that structure. And the last one is one that academy product out of Southampton, Jayden Meghoma, left back, played the England U17 team. I feel like anytime you get like a decent potential left back that's still quite young, like you can't probably go too wrong with that. And they didn't pay a lot.
I think the inbounds, definitely like the top end of the inbounds, as you said, we're a bit on the fence. I mean, Carvalho side. And I think outbounds, they've done okay. They've done well, actually, with Toney. Because he's 28-year-old. And I think that's another thing at getting 42 million pounds for 28-year-old. That's pretty good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also like 1 year left on his contract, right? So they were going to lose whatever, or they were going to, get a small fee in the January window. So I'm sure that they're pretty pleased with that. David Raya technically counts on their outgoings, but that feels like a deal that happened years ago. It just happens to be an accounting thing that's still there. I think Kim was a little more positive in her grades than we were. You and I both gave the overall in Brentford, or the outgoings were sort of a B plus, and the overalls a B. I mean, that's a solid window for a team that is mostly a solid Premier League team at this point.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the darlings. Let's go back down to the South Coast and talk about Tony Bloom's Brighton.
Yeah. It's funny that they also in the alphabetical order, they're next to each other, Brentford and Brighton. It's like because they over the past 5 years, I've heard them mentioned together because of the owners' betting backgrounds, even though they're built very differently.
Oh yeah, we were so jealous when I was at Brentford of like Bloom's budget. Like we were so tiny. Like Tony Bloom's out there building the Amex Stadium, what 5-6 years before Brentford got their stadium off the ground. So they were moving early, but also like I think the early years of Brighton in the Championship were like a lot of overspending on players that weren't necessarily as good as they thought they were, and it took them a while to get dialed in. I think now when you look at their recruitment, they are as dialed in as any group in the whole world and have been for about 5 years.
Yeah, totally. I think they've also, I think I mean, if you look at their transfer balance just this year, inbounds versus outbounds, I think they are the ones that spent the most in the Premier League this season. But then you have to look at the context of maybe a few more years backwards and see that they've definitely amassed a lot of positive balance or surplus.
Just like cashing like 50 to 100 million pound checks for a few years there. Like, yep, okay, you can have him, but it's 65 million. It's 110 million for guys that we got for 25. Like that's pretty good business if you can do it in a repeatable fashion.
Yeah, and even with that, I think that, you know, for a club like Brighton, that amount of red, if you see just the transfer balance this window, it does give me a pause. Like, what if you know, some of these guys don't pan out or they get injured? But I think that all signs pointing to the way they've been operated, I think they've definitely earned that credit to that they know what they definitely know what they're doing, and I think they've done really well this window.
I think one of the reasons why you can feel comfortable with their window is one, they didn't have anybody that looks like it's over 40 million paid, right? Two, they restocked the cabinet, in some cases from really long-term replacements. So they need to replace Pascal Gross, who was a fantastic servant for the club. And they needed to get a little bit younger in that area. They also needed to replace some depth because they obviously had sold very well and they were running a little bit thin. One thing they don't have right now is a great academy, and it's not that they're not investing in it; they just haven't had it. So when I look at the recruitment here, like Jorginho Rutter is fine. He's basically, you're paying market rate for a pretty good / good young attacker. Yankuba Minteh, I thought, was the signing of the summer. I feel like when you find somebody that does what he does, he's a little less polished than a Jamal Musiala, but you get him for 30 million ish. And he's a left footer. That's a slam dunk, and you can't complain about that. It's more of a shock that other teams were not in there. We don't know that maybe like Newcastle were refusing to sell to bigger teams that were on top of it. Like, he's not an unknown entity, but he was probably one of the guys that I watched this summer that I was most surprised by how good he was and how good I felt like he could be even in a top league. The other one that I wanted to flag up that I think was really good business was Mats Wieffer. So the DM market, and Ryan O'Hanlon had a good piece on this on ESPN recently. But the defensive midfielder market is very frothy. If you find a good defensive midfielder for a 25 million pounds, like, you've done great business at the Premier League level, because most defensive midfielders, the market price is about 40 to 50, and then they spike up to 100, which is where Declan Rice was. So that one seems pretty good too. I did want to. So with Brighton, I mean, we could tell stories about this forever because I have inside information. You probably have been around the way. But with Brighton, I think the thing that gets lost here is people keep stealing their managerial talent, right? People keep stealing their directors of football, the people that run recruitment for them. It's Tony Bloom's club. And at the end of the day, like, it's Tony Bloom's project that keeps coming out with these awesome things. You can take a lot of people out of there, and it has not dented the progress of that club. And I think that this is really important to note. There is a very good chance that this club right here is going to be part of that big 7 that we currently sort of exist, or big 6 in the Premier League. Like, it might be a 7 or 8 deep. These guys could certainly replace Newcastle as the potential Champions League team from outside traditional names on a regular basis. Like, they are that good at what they do. They understand the coaches that they need. There's nobody else like this in world football right now that feels like they're on the cusp of becoming like potential giants.
Yeah, and I think the spending this window, even with the new coach like Fabian Hürzeler, that underlines that they have an Uber plan just beyond coach or our player, I think, okay, we are ready now to be able to make this splash or this level of investment and make this team stronger and probably push for, as you said, initially maybe a Champions League spot. And
yeah, it's like we figured it out. There's not that much risk anymore. Let's go for it. And they've turned it over a few different times now. So they probably had money in the bank that was waiting for this opportunity. Would you take a risk on a 31-year-old coach?
I would have said no, but prior to this summer, I was working on a project that was basically, I was looking at all the coaches in Europe and South America, trying to analyze their effectiveness and style and metrics. It's really hard. There's not enough data, and tried to do a few different approaches. Try to kind of eliminate the outcome elements out of the game, like goals, XG, because that's a lot dependent on the player talent. And in 2-3 different ways that when I did the analysis, Hürzeler was one of the outlier every time, like in multiple ways. And definitely at that point, we're like, oh, he is definitely going to go to a bigger club in the summer. So and boom, he moves to Brighton from St. Pauli, right? And St. Pauli got promoted, and then he moves to Brighton. And you watch the first couple of games, it feels like he's not a new or a rookie coach in the Premier League. It feels like it's pretty normal. It's been like he's been there, done that for a while. So as I said, like if it was in vacuum, I would have said probably I won't trust. But I think because I have this background, going into the summers, I was like, okay, I am not surprised he's there. Another kind of curious bit, just a trivia piece around him. He was born in Houston, USA.
But part of the Bayern Munich academy, so like moved very early on, I guess.
Yeah,
it's funny. We usually think of these things the opposite way around. There'll be American servicemen serving in Germany, and there's been this long lineage of U.S. national team players that are their dads were American servicemen, and they brought them back over. They were born and sort of schooled in Germany. This is like a little bit of the flip side, which is quite unusual.
Yeah.
Tedesco is another guy, I think, that is American heritage, like New Jersey, and he also has been plying his trade in Deutschland.
Yeah, his name was in the limelight for a couple of weeks when he was rumored to have been offered the U.S. national team job.
Don't do that. Same as Wagner, David Wagner. Like don't force the U.S. national team fans to watch David Wagner's football. It's just not. There's no pleasantness in that. It's just brutal. But what wasn't brutal was Brighton's window. And in fact, I think that we are, optimistic enough to suggest that over the next couple of years, you could see them regularly challenging for those Champions League spots, especially with the right coach. I'm not sure that De Zerbi was the right coach. I think that some of what De Zerbi inherited was, a lot of the discipline that had come from previous head coaches that spun out a little bit, and they were happy to move him along or let him move along to elsewhere. And they've definitely been super aggressive in the replacement, but we feel like their window was aggressive. It was relatively low, moderate ticket prices on a bunch of players that we think still have good upside. And even their sales, like Dennis Undav, if they actually got 25 million for Dennis, like that's awesome. Anything like sort of 10 to 15 would have been fine. So this is a B plus, maybe slightly better window for them. We'll see what they look like for the rest of the season, but it certainly looks like a lot of promise in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
For those of you listening to us, please subscribe, give us 5-star reviews on whatever platform you happen to be on. We are trying to continue to grow, and the feedback's been great. Like, people seem to love what we've been doing, both in the newsletter, which is on the transferflow.com/subscribe, and on the podcast/video podcast/ doing it to us on the YouTube. As often as you do. We have 3 more segments of transfer grades to come. So if we didn't cover your team today, look for us in one of the future episodes. And thank you very much for listening.